right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming right after lunch. Know that that's a lot going on. I saw that line out there, and that's no joke. But today, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about technology just in general and how it may or may not make sense for an OT environment. So just super quick about myself is I've been working in these sort of environments for a long time, in OT environments. So have worked offshore, have worked in West Texas, lived about in West Texas, really commissioning systems just throughout the country in these OT environments. So super familiar with technology, how it applies to industry, but I've also worked in the other side, on the IT side of the house. So I've been doing this for about 15 years now, so working for oil and gas companies. I'm here out of Houston, working for chemical industry, stuff like that. So, and I personally love technology, but what I like to do is really to bridge the gap between the industrial environment as well as data centers and cloud. So I've worked in engineering, operations, enterprise IT, all of it. But right now today I am the CTO of Remexa, which is really a professional services company that's tech agnostic. We don't care if the technology is built for OT or IT. What we care about is whether or not it has the capabilities to solve the problems that we have in industry. So definitely enough about me. But what we do want to talk about today is the stuff that I didn't start my life with, but is critically important when we're talking about technology, and that is the people side of the business. And people who have worked in OT cybersecurity, this is absolutely not a revelation, but it's critically important as we talk about technology. So we kind of have these two circles, and you'll see these colors throughout the presentation. But on the left-hand side it doesn't have to be the COO, but really it's the persona of the person or the people or the organization that's accountable for the safe and reliable operations of the industrial environment. So whoever those people are, they have an accountability for those safe and reliable industrial operations. On the right-hand side we have those that are accountable for cybersecurity of not just OT, but IT, but everything, right? The cybersecurity of the whole enterprise. And us, as cybersecurity professionals, we're kind of stuck in the middle, and sometimes it sucks because a lot of times these really aren't defined who owns OT cyber, but there is some opportunity in chaos. So because we have the attention of both of these different types of personas, we can sort of steer the conversation from a technology and a risk perspective that makes sense for both sides of these organizations. Okay. And again, those who've worked in this industry for a while, this is OT cyber. I'm sure you have heard all of these things before. But the biggest one is, and all of these are true and they're all valid, is that IT just doesn't understand operating environments. They might understand the tech, they may understand critical systems like SAP and stuff like that, but they just don't understand the operating environment. Completely true. I've worked in enterprise IT, and that's a true statement. They are ultimately responsible for keeping the facilities running, which is their primary goal. If anything gets introduced into that environment that can compromise that, it's a complete non-starter. And perhaps the biggest one is that the risks of industrial environments are inherently different than IT. I will not go into the CIA triad. It's been said a million times before, but it is true is that there's different priorities in IT than OT. But there's things that we can align on that we'll go on a little bit further. And on the right side is, as IT professionals, the OT or the cybersecurity tech stack is just like completely out of control. I think the number was typically in an enterprise organization, there's about 16 different cybersecurity vendors or technologies that compromise their tech stack. To double that for OT, to have a separate tech stack is insane. Like, it's just not possible. We can't double the staff. We just don't have the people to be able to manage that amount of tech sprawl. The next biggest one, of course, is that OT is a black box. They don't really understand it, and from a persona standpoint, they just may never get the information from the operations personnel. And of course, the last one is that I have limited staff, I have limited budget. I can't double the amount of technology that I'm responsible for. So all very common, but at the end of the day, here's kind of the TLDR sort of point of this entire talk, really, is that IT technology in OT environments was really never, ever, ever the issue. What it is, in my opinion, is that the IT folks who have a great understanding of the technology itself, more so even than the OT folks, the operations folks, don't understand the risk. And if they don't understand the risk, they cannot configure and they cannot architect technology in a way that makes sense for industrial environments. So that is to say that the operations folks should lend their expertise not in the technology, but in operational risk over to IT. And then IT lends their technology expertise over to OT. So really, at the end of the day, if we don't do this, and I've seen it before, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, is if IT doesn't understand the operational risk, or if the operations folks deploy a technology that they don't quite understand, both scenarios are bad, and they both almost invariably cause a misconfiguration that takes extremely expensive technology and makes it useless, or worse, introduces more risk into the environment rather than mitigating anything. So what does this kind of look like from a flowchart diagram? So the idea is that there are two separate disciplines. IT and OT absolutely are separate disciplines. They have different risk profiles. They have different environments. But there can be, and I would contend that there should be, one tech stack that services both of them. So as you can kind of see here, you have your OT, or we'll just call it, I couldn't write operations, but operational risk is on the top there, completely independent of IT. IT has their own risk profile. What happens is we take those risks, that informs tech selection by way of technical requirements. We'll go over what those requirements could be a little bit later on. But each of those risks informs tech selection, and then that risk then ultimately drives the architecture and the configuration of that technology. So that is to say that on the IT and OT side, independent risks, the same tech stack that addresses those risks, but then we diverge again as we do a fit-for-purpose architecture and configuration that serves both of those environments. This helps with simplification. You have a lot more leverage with your technology vendors when you're able to do this. Okay, and we've done this before, and sometimes there is some contention around tech diversity, which I think is completely fair, in that, hey, if I have a perimeter firewall and it's Palo Alto or whatever, and I want to have a Fortinet firewall protecting OT because if there's a 0-day in my Palo, it won't go to my Fortinet or vice versa or whatever, right? And I think that's a valid point. However, if we take a look back at a risk lens, there can be a lot more risk in misconfiguring two completely different environments than the low likelihood of there being a 0-day that affects one and not the other. And a lot of the reason is, and this particularly goes for embedded systems like firewalls, is that at the end of the day, they both use a lot of the underlying open source libraries. So if you have a 0-day in that open source library, it affects both of them anyway. So that is to say is tech diversity can reduce risk, but typically we have found when we do risk assessments is that the amount of risk that tech diversity reduces, it ends up introducing more risk based on the misconfiguration of those different technologies. So this is one that at least I've heard before is, what about CrowdStrike? And CrowdStrike sucked. It absolutely did. It happened. We're still around. However, if we would have done a risk assessment on CrowdStrike, we would have said that there needs to be a way for us to deploy updates in a test environment or a staging environment before it went to OT, in which case it just wouldn't have been the right technology to deploy into that environment in the first place. So that is to say is that something like CrowdStrike can be a great technology, just understand the risks, which drives those technical requirements, and that will ultimately drive what the tech selection is.
So you're saying that CrowdStrike
It can be, depends on your risk profile. I don't see why not.
Have internet access directly down to DCS?
You can have, so based on the requirements of your zones and conduits, I don't see why not. Actually, I could go completely into the Purdue model because, yeah, man, the Purdue model does not ring true to me. But certainly, if there is a zone and conduits, if there is not a requirement to have, let's say, a proxy between OT and IT, well, then that's just what the requirement is or is not. And if they do require a proxy, well, you can implement that as well. But one thing I hear a lot, and as somebody who's works at an OT company, I like to think that we're pretty special, that we do have our own risks, and and that sometimes the IT organization just doesn't understand our world. They just don't understand the criticality of the facilities that we operate day in and day out. And I think that is true. However, I would contend, at least with my colleagues that I've worked with in enterprise IT, is that they do run critical systems, because even though there even if you have an air gap between IT and OT, which is exceedingly rare, how long will a facility run if the organization can't pay their employees or suppliers? Let's say that that ERP system is down, and you can run product all day. Your DCS is fine. Your control systems are working as needed, but you can't pay your employees, your operators. Like, I know operators, they will not work for free. None of them will work for free, or suppliers. So IT does operate physical or critical systems that affects OT, even if there's not a data connection between the two. And as well, if an organization can't track or invoice products, there is no reason for an organization to exist if it can't invoice and charge its customers. It doesn't matter what we make. If we're refining petrochemicals, does not matter. If we can't track and invoice what that product is, there's no reason for that business to exist. So the bottom line is that IT does indeed secure critical infrastructure, just different critical infrastructure. It's critical infrastructure that may not be critical for society, but it's critical for their own business to run, which in some of those cases, that's what they care about the most. And yeah, many systems outside of the OT environment are critical to business survival, not human life, which is ultimately what we're trying to protect, especially in OT. But again, there's no reason for a company to exist if it cannot invoice and essentially drive revenue and make a profit. So it really is that it's not an issue of the technology itself or even the skill of the IT people. It's usually that these enterprise IT folks just do not understand the nuance of industrial risk and what that means when it comes to deploying that sort of technology into an OT environment. So what's the point of all of that? Well, the point of that is essentially I would like to make a case for simplification, specifically technology simplification. Number one benefit that you get from that is better manageability. And what do I mean by that? It shows it right here, right? You get simple and better architecture that is fit for purpose for both of those environments. You have better configuration because you understand how that technology works more at a fundamental level. You have less tech sprawl. You can monitor that technology better because you understand how to get the data ingested into your SIM or wherever it needs to go. And you have better use of technical features, because I've seen it a lot where you could have a firewall or a SIM or whatever deployed into IT and OT, and if you have the same team managing both, they don't understand both the technical features of all of them. So essentially, you're spending money and you're not getting the value. The second one is, for simplification, is the enhanced capability. So, and I probably won't make any friends with some of people that are OT technology vendors out there, but hear me out, is that don't worry about the branding or the marketing or whatever of what the OT technology says. If it's an OT remote access solution or risk management solution, don't worry about that at all. Just worry about the capability of that technology. What sort of risks can that technology mitigate? What sort of controls can that technology satisfy, which ultimately controls go back to risk mitigation? And it doesn't matter if it can be in IT or OT. I've seen some OT companies out there on the floor that the capability of their technology could work just as well in IT and OT. If it fulfills the capability or it fulfills the technical need, it can exist in both environments. And why is that? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, most of these systems, there are embedded systems with PLCs and remote I/O and stuff like that. But most of these systems are just Windows systems, like anything else. So the problems to solve in both IT and OT from a cybersecurity standpoint, I would contend that they're very similar in both environments. And we'll kind of count the ways a little bit here about what that sort of means. Because as an organization, we do a lot of technical evaluations. And so I want to go through a couple of here of, hey, if I need a remote access solution for OT, what are some of the technical capabilities that are required for the organization to be able to get that capability? And I just wanted to go through a thought exercise around, hey, if we need a remote access solution, what are the technical requirements that are needed? And do they make sense for both IT and OT? And you'll kind of see how this will kind of work. But for remote access, for example, you'll see a bunch of green checkboxes, like a ton. Because the technical requirements that we typically see for an OT environment, for remote access, align basically one-to-one with IT. So why are we using two separate technology? They can be two separate instances of the same technology, but why are we not using the same technology if the technical requirements are basically the same for something like remote access? There will always be exceptions, but this at least is what we found when we do these sort of analyses. So let's go through another one. So endpoint security. This is where we start diverging a little bit. However, most of the time, you can see the green check boxes, we typically are looking at technical requirements that make sense for both environments. Where things start diverging a little bit is an on-premise option, which may be something that makes sense or might be required based on your risk profile for an OT environment. Those things are kind of going the way of the dodo from an endpoint security standpoint. Or data loss prevention may not be a big deal in OT. If you're refining petrochemicals, we know how that works. Now, you could have proprietary recipes. Flow rates might be proprietary, stuff like that. But in general, I have seen that DLP is more something that the IT folks care more about than the OT folks.
So what about legacy systems in OT? Because that's the reality of every single OT environment. So you can't install CrowdStrike on NT4. Right?
Totally. Totally, yeah, so.
What do you do when Honeywell voids all your support contracts because you installed an agent that they didn't approve?
Oh man, so I call them engineered system, but DCSs are a classic example of that. So yeah, so there's always gonna be exceptions, particularly with those sort of things, where, with Honeywell, you're gonna use Trellix EPO, like you just are, because you're not gonna void your warranty. If you're gonna be using Emerson Delta V, you're going to be using EPO too. Is that the best-in-class solution? No, but it's not worth the risk of putting in, let's say, CrowdStrike and voiding your warranty versus just going with the vendor-approved solution. So again, it sort of starts at the risk, and those things will kind of work themselves out because you're totally right, man. Like there's going to be restrictions based, particularly upon DCS vendors. They're not going to qualify something like CrowdStrike. So I'm with you there 100%. So for something like asset identification and monitoring, these are ones that this has been explosive in OT. Armis, Nozomi, Dragos, I mean, there's a ton of them out there. And a lot of them have solved very specific and valuable, I'd say, use cases in the OT environment. But some of them as well are getting into the IT environment as well. And I think that's a really good idea because at the end of the day, you shouldn't really care if your asset is OT or IT, and a lot of times organizations can't even define what an OT or an IT asset is, and most of the time it may not even matter because you want all of your assets to be categorized as an enterprise anyway. And you can kind of see here is that most of these technical requirements as well make sense for both sides of the environment. There's probably less of a cloud need in OT, although it's changing slightly, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. But typically, the idea is that, yeah, you take these great asset monitoring capabilities that really have been developed for OT, why not bring them into IT? They're great at doing asset identification across the board. And some of these vendors are starting to get into that. But anyway, the idea is, again, with some small exceptions, the technical requirements for an asset identification and monitoring solution are the same for both IT and OT. From a firewall standpoint, this is where things start to diverge a little bit, mostly around the environmentals. So for things like OT environments, you might have class 1 div 2 requirements, 24 volts DC. You might have DIN rail requirements, which just doesn't even make sense for IT typically, unless you're running Wi-Fi in the facility. Things like protocol enforcement. So for those of you old school that are familiar with the old Tofinos, and you're able to do Modbus function code restrictions or register or coil restrictions, that's something that really doesn't make too much sense in IT. But by and large, many of the vendors, at least that we deal with day to day, from a firewall standpoint, they have a product portfolio that works for IT, chassis-based giant stuff, as well as for OT, that are 24 volts, that are DIN rail mountable, that can do some protocol enforcement of OT, but not well. But I would contend that I have seen sometimes where organizations want to enforce, let's say, Modbus reads, read coil only. I almost never see where an organization restricts from a firewall standpoint what something can read, like the actual registers and coils it can read. So it's a cool capability. It's been around for a really long time. I just don't see it used very much. And sort of the benefit that you get from that and the maintenance of it probably doesn't outweigh the benefits of being able to use all of the other unified feature sets of an IT/OT solution. Network infrastructure, again, really where this starts to diverge is how the topology and the physical environment that these things are in. The big ones are around things like ring networks, which isn't a big thing in at least enterprise IT these days, super common in OT. The thing is that just like with firewalls, the vendors that we typically see on the plant floor have both enterprise capabilities as well as OT capabilities because they just have different product lines that meets both of those objectives. And really what the difference is not the tech itself or the vendor, it's the architecture. Remember, the architecture is still separate between IT and OT, and we have to account for those things. So architecture, for example, would be a device that understands ring topologies or a device that understands, let's say, real-time protocols, right? Like things like motion control, stuff like that. Most large vendors will understand both, let's say, MLAG, right, which is a very like an enterprise type of technology, as well as ring protocol technologies like DLR and REP or MRP, stuff like that. Backup and recovery, almost across the board, the backup and recovery solutions work for both sides with the very particular exception of backing up PLCs. And I don't see a lot of people doing it, but the people that do find it extremely helpful, and that's something that you really need a point solution to do. So, if you're a Rockwell shop, Asset Center is probably the one. There's only a couple of vendors that do this sort of thing, and it's probably going to be a point solution for OT. It's just what makes sense for that environment. But if you're backing up your engineering workstations, your HMIs, your tag servers, anything that's a Windows server, which is most of the stuff in the environment, save for process control itself, any old backup solution will work. And they have, they can do virtualized physical. To your point on legacy OSs, that could be a contention there that may make sense in OT. But overall, why not just use one technical solution that solves the technical problems of both environments? And the last one is where things really start to get wonky in OT, is patching. So typically in the IT environment, what's becoming very common these days is Intune, using things like Windows Auto Patch, stuff like that. I would we've done many of these risk analysis. Doing automated patching in OT, I think everyone can agree, is just a bad idea. Like, just do not do that. The technical capabilities to do qualified patch lists and patching is getting less and less by the day. And what we're starting to see, these are still super early days, is that patching absolutely makes sense in IT. Do Windows Auto Patch whenever you can, except for certain critical systems where it may not make sense. But if we have a lot of these really great technical and configuration controls in OT, in the risk assessment, it may not even make sense to do patching at all in OT. It may not make sense to get an aging point solution that are sort of going away to do patching that could even introduce risk into your environment if you have enough compensating controls to just not do patching at all. And we're starting to see that more and more, where you don't do patching on a monthly or quarterly or annual basis. You do patching when you do a turnaround. So whenever you upgrade, let's say, the DCS software or the engineering workstation software or whatever, you just go through a full cycle of you upgrade all of that software, you update all of your Windows patches, and you're done. You only do it at that cadence if you have enough compensating controls, only because the capabilities for patching in a way that makes sense for OT from a technical standpoint is just not there anymore. Okay. So, sorry, this is a super busy slide, but I'll just sort of explain it quickly. So what do we kind of do about this, right? So we have our zones and conduits down here between IT and OT. We have our OT firewall. We have seen this before, and it's happening a little bit more and more, where that you have a unified IT and OT capability that are delivered by SaaS providers, which means you don't have any of your own OT DMZ. You don't even have an IT DMZ. You just have cloud instances that you have great monitoring on. And the big difference is that always, 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 at least that we've seen from risk assessments, is that identity specifically between IT and OT needs to be separate. So different Active Directory domains, different Entra ID tenants, that sort of thing, because if you compromise the identity of one, essentially it's game over. So those are the ones where, at least that we have seen, makes the most sense, is to keep those things completely separate. You may be able to unify other cybersecurity technologies, identity separate. But for some customers, it makes more sense to say, okay, I have a technical requirement, kind of like you mentioned, where I cannot talk directly from, let's say, the control zone, or Purdue, let's call it level 2, directly out to the internet. Can't do that. So what I can do is I can have a dedicated OT DMZ, again, identity still separate, but I just have proxy servers so that I have one place where all of my data is going. I could have like a Gigamon or an aggregator tap there to get all of my data, but the management plane of all of my solutions are still managed by IT. But from a data flow perspective, I'm routing through a dedicated OT DMZ. That's a potential solution. The third one is the one that I've seen the most, and probably the one that I would recommend for most people, is that you have a dedicated OT DMZ that services the OT environment and has the configuration and the architecture that makes sense for that environment. And they're independent instances of that technology, that cybersecurity technology, between IT and OT. So if there is a misconfiguration on the IT side, or likewise on the OT side, it doesn't propagate between the two different environments. However, you have the benefit of having the same tech stack, so you can use templates, lessons learned, configurations on both sides of the house without having that potential configuration contamination. So it's sort of a hybrid approach where you do unify the tech stack, but there might be multiple tech instances that you leverage between those two different environments. So I guess at the end of the day, I guess no secret here, but the idea is that operational folks can learn from IT and the other way around, where that IT will never, ever, ever understand operational risk to the extent that the operations folks do. And the operations folks are typically responsible for their day-to-day. They might be fantastic automation engineers. They may be great process engineers, but they don't have the sweat and the blood and the tears of implementing cybersecurity technology that their IT brethren have. So using those individual expertise to drive technology selection from the risks that they understand, that's the way to go. And as a tech guy, what we try to do is we just love the new shiny thing, but I would say which is bring it back to risk. And when we bring it back to risk, then we end up making the correct technology decisions to sort of drive outcomes that make sense for the business. So from a TLDR standpoint, number one is evaluate technology on how it satisfies operational requirements and reduces risk, not that it's just marketed to OT. It's awesome that it's marketed to OT. That means they probably have use cases that make sense for OT, but look at the capabilities, and I think that you'll find that most of the capabilities that either a tool that's marketed for IT or OT will satisfy the same technical requirements, and they can be used across both. And that leads into number two, where we do want to unify and simplify where it makes sense. And we found, based on a lot of assessments, that many times it does from a technical standpoint. Exceptions always exist, particularly for engineered systems like DCSs, but where you can, and where you can perhaps influence some of your DCS vendors to be able to integrate your tech stack, that's, as an asset owner, you have the ability to help influence product roadmaps with your DCS vendors, as much as they might cry and scream. We work with them closely all the time. They are listening to their customers, and some of their customers, they are able to put their own tech stack on there and maintain warranty. And the number four is that, yeah, I love technology. I love implementing technology, but at the end of the day, it's the operational risk that matters, which informs that tech selection and then drives the architecture and configuration, which is almost always more important than the tech itself. The tech itself can be great. It can have enormous capabilities, but if it's configured incorrectly or architected incorrectly for the individual environment it's in, again, it can be worse than useless, and we've seen that it actually can introduce a lot of risk into environment, typically by data flows, by incorrect data flows out of the environment. So protect your investment by bringing everything back to risk, which drives that architecture and configuration. So that is all I got. And feel free to throw tomatoes at me. And that's totally cool. But if you have any questions, I am here for it. Thank you, guys. Yeah, man.
I got a question for you. So I'm with you for the most part, minus the EDR stuff. But
Sure.
like, what are your thoughts on DoD's projects to introduce zero trust into OT environments?
I think
That is largely an IT solution, right?
totally, man. And I think the concept of never trust, always verify, I think is a noble one. Is it practical in OT? I think it'll get there. I think OT will be one of the last, only because with the processing power and the life cycle times of OT equipment, particularly when it comes to I/O and PLCs, there's going to have to be an element of implicit trust, probably as long as we're going to be in this business. So I think that there's probably a case for something like microsegmentation in certain parts of the facility, but I think that typically when you're talking between HMI and controllers, I think there's going to be a level of implicit trust there, and that's just going to be a trust zone for a long time. Well, cool. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you.